Okay, welcome. Today we are going to talk about postmodern approaches in economics in general, postmodernism and pluralism, another popular concept these days in economics. So we can start with the Enlightenment because the idea of postmodernity is basically a critique, or it is based upon a critique of postmodernism and the Enlightenment. Modernity usually starts with the, 16th century, with the Copernicus revolution, maybe 1543, but most importantly, Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, and finally Newton, especially the modern science, starts with modern physics of Isaac Newton. So in the 17th century, more or less, we can start the age of enlightenment. First with the development of modern science, then its repercussions in philosophy and social sciences in general. We can distinguish between three strands of the Enlightenment thought. One is the British one, the other is French, and the German. The British one is usually associated with political economy, interestingly, because Adam Smith is an important member of the British or Scottish, actually, Enlightenment, together with David Hume. And in France, it's a bit more radical. It's about changing society in a better way in terms of progress, etc., etc. And then finally, the German idealism usually is associated with Kant and later Hegel. And this strand of idealism is both a form of enlightenment and also, interestingly, a critique of the Enlightenment thought. So maybe we can talk about these differences in another time, but today we can start with the basic ideas upon which Enlightenment philosophy is based. One is the autonomy of reason. Reason as a human faculty is capable of finding answers about everything, about nature, about society, about human beings themselves, etc. The second point is the belief in the progress and perfection. History moves in a progressive way towards a better society, towards more freedom, etc. And only through reason, as a third one, can knowledge be attained. The principles governing nature, humanity, and society can be understood through reasons. And the reason must be sharpened through education. Education is important, right? And the opposition is to any authority, be it scientific or religious or political authority, that denies reason. And the cosmopolitan solidarity of the Enlightenment individuals or internationalism idea, and the uniqueness of individual and the oneness of mankind, so to speak. This phrase is taken from Polanyi. So these are the basic ideas. So there's only one true answer for every question, and this answer can be found through reasoning, right? Reasoning is the most important faculty that human being has. Through our reason, we can understand what's going on around us, around the universe, etc., etc. So this is the basic idea, but there are also some, excuse me, maybe before that, one of the best definitions of enlightenment was given by Immanuel Kant himself in his an answer to the question, what is enlightenment? This is an interview for a newspaper at that time, 1784. He says, enlightenment is man's, human beings, emergence from her self-imposed immaturity. Immaturity is the inability to use one's understanding without guidance from another. This immaturity is self-imposed when its cause lies not in lack of understanding, but in lack of resolve and courage to use use it without guidance from another. So Saperot, dare to know, have courage to use own understanding. That is the motto of enlightenment. So in order for us to be mature human beings, we have to learn how to use our own reason and defy the authority that denies reason, etc. But there are also some criticisms towards enlightenment, which actually started in the very period in which enlightenment philosophy emerges. That's interesting. One of the most important criticism is developed by the German idealism, as I have already told. I'm going to give an example for this in due course, but still, especially with the rise of postmodernity, these criticisms became very sharp and strong criticism, started to be directed to Enlightenment idea, basically. And in this respect, we can distinguish among some important general themes or theses in the postmodernist thought. One is the skepticism towards science and reason, of course. Enlightenment idea emphasizes the importance of reason and therefore science, modern science, etc. On the other hand, postmodern thinking questions the validity of science, its methods, its ideas, etc., etc. And this criticism actually started in the 1960s. Remember Thomas Kuhn's The Scientific Revolution book, and then later through Feyerabend, for example, finally, it created the idea that anything goes. There is no unique method in science, etc. And also criticism of scientism, the questions about nature, about the universe, about human beings, about society or anything can be found through science and science only. Is criticized heavily, and the notion of progress is denied. There's no such thing as historical progress, for example, or the progress of the societies, etc. History does not move in a specific direction in a progressive fashion. This is a myth, according to that. And also this emphasis on the other and on the difference, especially the idea of multiculturalism is based upon this. Actually, this is the continuation of the position that we are already accustomed with, which is the hermeneutical thinking, right? The differences of cultures, differences of meanings, their understanding in different societies or in different epochs or in different periods of time, basically. So everything depends on interpretation. So when we, including science, when we are to talk about thinking, we should consider the importance of this interpretive understanding, right? We have some categories of culture, for example, we are born with, and therefore, whenever we see something, whenever we try to understand what's going on in nature, for example, we have to use these categories, and these categories require some kinds of interpretation. So there is no such thing as the scientific truth, actually. There are more than, if you will, one truth. So this is very interesting, and differences are important from a historical point of view, from a societal point of view, or even from a scientific point of view. Remember Feyerabend's idea? He says there are some traditions in science, and traditions are neither good nor bad, they simply are. So any scientific tradition is as good as the other because each tradition is based upon some particular premises. In Kuhn, for example, the idea of paradigm is based upon the ideas or visions of the scientific community, right? The scientists usually define what is the truth So on the basis of their definition and answer to this question, they develop their methods and how science is supposed to do, etc. So this can easily be generalized to other aspects of human existence. So in science, in society, in human beings, even in language, we can have the same principles, the importance of difference and the other, the multiculturalism thing. And closely linked to this is another one, the interest in the particular and the indigenous in distinction to the general and the universal. So there's no such thing as the human being, for example. There are differences among human beings with respect to culture, with respect to their religious beliefs, etc., etc. These differences are important. So a particularist outlook must be adopted even in science, right? So they are against the grand narratives or mega narratives in this sense. So they dislike of doctrines and general worldviews, mega narratives, because particularity is important. And the stress of the connection between knowledge and power relations, even in science, we have these kind of power relations, the relationship between the teacher and the students is an example of this, right? I hold the power and I can do within certain limits, of course, whatever I want to do in the name of science, etc., etc. So Giddens, for example, once says that classroom actually, or the school in general, is a power container in which power is continuously created and reproduced. So this is interesting. Well, actually, one of the sources, interestingly, of this view is Marx. In Marx, these power relations are important. Also, the differences of opinions according to the class positions that one has, for example, right? It's the same words, but the two classes, the capitalist or the bourgeoisie and the working class or the proletariat, see the same thing in different ways. So there are multiplicity of truths in that sense, and therefore there should be multiplicity of views or worldviews. So mega narratives are not enough to understand the complexity, so to speak, of the reality itself. And also this, again, I said, this criticism of the Enlightenment starts with the emergence, actually, of the Enlightenment thought. One example is the German expressionist thinking. So basically, it's a reaction to the 18th century French and British Enlightenment. British Enlightenment is basically, and the French also, empiricist, mechanist, determinist, atomist, and utilitarian, but German expressionism is a critique of these dualities, basically. And according to them, human activity and history should be seen as human self-expression, so that's why the word expressionism. Expressionism emphasizes the importance of human action and that life is directed towards self-realization, etc., etc. So another point is that in the case of Enlightenment thought, there are these dualities and even dualisms between, life against thought, sentience against rationality, knowledge against will. These kinds of ideas should be rejected. So this is, I don't know, this can be seen as a kind of reactionary position. But after the 80s and 90s especially, it starts, the postmodern thinking starts in the 1970s, basically, and two important names associated with this idea is the Lyotard and Derrida. Derrida has this famous book, what was that, The Ghost of Marx or something like this, The Spectre of Marx. And Lyotard's book is Postmodernism or whatever, I don't know. They are interesting pieces, actually. I would recommend you to read them. And the term, as I know, was coined by Lyotard, French guy. It's French to me. So basically, from an epistemological point of view, how science is supposed to do something, and we can again distinguish among some theses which are not exhaustive, which is not an exhaustive list actually. One idea is that rival paradigms have distinct criteria to validate their theories, which in turn preclude the possibility of cross-evaluating their substantive propositions. So there is no single or unique criterion for the validation of knowledge and therefore science. There are more than one. So each rival paradigm has its own criterion to validate its own theory. So if this is the case, and the possibility of cross-evaluating substantive propositions is not easy to do so, even it may be impossible. Second thesis is that rival explanations are parts of different knowledge structures, which renders them intelligible solely within the meaning of terms that constitute them. This is the main hermeneutical point, as we can remember, right? So different knowledge structures are based upon different senses of meaning, different senses of reference frameworks, etc., premises. So they are also incommensurable. You cannot compare one another. So that's the basic problem. And rival paradigms are metaphysically plural. That is, they cut up the world in different but equally legitimate ways. Traditions are neither good nor bad, they simply are. There are more than scientific tradition, etc., etc. And explanations of events and behavior cannot be made from value-neutral standpoints, because there can be no logical distinction between statements of value and statements of fact. So that's the famous criticism against Humean idea of the distinction between facts and values, right? So there's no such thing as the value-neutral social science or positive economics, because our positive economics itself is based upon some kind of value judgments, such as human beings are rational, or they should act in a rational way, etc. And another interesting example for the defense of this postmodern thinking was developed by Deirdre McCloskey in the late 80s, and she wrote a book. Her book was published in, I don't know, 91 or 92, something like that, and second edition was 98. So it's a very interesting book, but it started with an article, and I also put that article into the Google Classroom, so you are expected to read it, and it's an interesting piece and also amusing, I would say. And first of all, she talks about what rhetoric is. She says basically her basic idea is that economics is a form of rhetoric, not a science maybe, or actually it's a science, but it's a rhetorical science. I don't know, what is rhetoric then? He uses some book, Modern Dogma and the Rhetoric of Assent, I have no idea, by Wayne Booth, who she says gives some definitions. Rhetoric, according to him, is the art of probing what men believe they ought to believe. Art of probing what men believe they ought to believe, rather than proving what is true according to abstract methods. It is the art of discovering good reasons, finding what really warrants assent, because any reasonable person ought to be persuaded It's a way of persuasion, actually, you know, right? That's the basic function of rhetoric, supposedly, at least. It is careful weighing of more or less good reasons to arrive at more or less probable or plausible conclusions. None too secure, but better than would be arrived at by chance or unthinking in thoughts, etc., etc. So, in short, she says, rhetoric is exploring thought by conversation. You know, it's a very different outlook from that of positivism, maybe, right? Basically, in positivism, we are dealing with science and the reality. So we have a single method, the unity of method thesis, which is the corroboration, trying to find facts, laws as covering law models, etc., etc. We have talked about them in our earlier class, right? I mean, method of science. So she says basically, economics should be seen as a kind of rhetoric, and this is a good thing, actually, as we will see. And according to her, again, McCloskey, among the precepts of modernism are: one, prediction and control is the goal of science. This is a positivistic idea, right? Only the observable implications or predictions of a theory matter to its truth, again, positivism. Three, observability entails objective, reproducible experiments, especially in the natural sciences, of course, if and only if an experimental implication of a theory proves false, is the theory proved false. Objectivity is to be treasured. Subjective observation or introspection is not scientific knowledge. And also Kelvin's dictum, Lord Kelvin, when you cannot express it in numbers, your knowledge is of a meager and unsatisfactory kind. This is the basic criterion for science, right? You should put them in numbers, mathematics, models, predictions, etc., etc. But these are all basic tenets of positivism, right? Basically positivistic science, and there have been many criticisms from different angles of this positivistic thought. But the postmodern idea or criticism almost amounts to a rejection of scientific activity. So in that also McCloskey seems to agree. So 7, introspection, metaphysical belief, aesthetics, and the like may well figure in the discovery of an hypothesis, but cannot figure in its justification. This is the position of Karl Popper's, basically, you know, conjectures and refutations and so forth. 8, it is the business of methodology to demarcate scientific reasoning from non-scientific, positive from normative. So famous Hume's guillotine thing, right? Science is different from metaphysics or ideology. Facts are different from values. Economics is a positive science, not a normative one, etc., etc. A scientific explanation of an event brings the event under a covering law. This is the famous covering law hypothesis. Scientists, like economists, have nothing to say as scientists about values, whether of morality or art. Positive economics, crap. Hume's fork. This is very interesting. These are Hume's words. When we run over libraries persuaded of these principles, you know, principles of this distinction or demarcation between science and non-science, what havoc must we make if we take in our hand any volume of divinity or school metaphysics, for instance, let us ask, does it contain any abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number? No. Commit it then to the flames, for it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion. It has nothing to do with science. These are the basic, according to McCloskey tenets of science, but one can say again, these are only tenets of the positivism, which can be distinguished from modernist thinking in general. Well, Enlightenment idea, of course, gives priority to reason, and through reason we are able to find the answers, we are capable of reaching the truth, etc., etc. But positivism is not the only way of using our own intellect or reasoning, and it is not the only scientific way. So, but still, this idea seems to be rejected by McCloskey. So she says basically, modernism is a poor method. It's obsolete in philosophy, the criticism of postmodernity basically. Falsification is not cogent, okay. Prediction is impossible in economics, okay. Modernism itself is impossible and is not followed, not okay. Any method is arrogant and pretentious, sounds like Bayraben. There is no such thing as the scientific method, anything goes. Any method is arrogant. Other sciences do not follow modernist methods. Well, I think here she has actually, a confusion between Enlightenment or modernity and positivism. They are not the same, as I would say. Well, maybe we should stop for now because we ran out of time. So let's stop here and continue in the next section.